All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the A's Philosophy YouTube channel. I am A's Philosophy, and here we pretty much discuss my philosophy. Um, and typically, it's just things that I think are important, and it can be quite random at times. Uh, for the most part, so far, I've been focusing on Christian theology, but I do have interest in other areas, and maybe I'll eventually get to some of those things. And it's all kind of related because it's all about trying to find out what the truth is. What is the ultimate truth, and how can we know it? And I really think that's what Jesus wanted people to do. He wanted people to know what the truth is. And today, we are going to be continuing our review series of my conversations with Matt Slick. So just a kind of update, if you go to my channel YouTube page, you can, let me see is the audio working fine? Let me get this real fast. I'm going to turn it up a little bit. If you go to my YouTube page, there's the home tab, and I think then there's a live tab. So, and then there's the video tab. The videos right now are things that you upload. The live tab is obviously live streams, and then you have the playlist. So if you go to the playlist, I think I have 3 playlists right now. I have a playlist for open rooms and discussions that I've had, and I've had some chess streams, which are obviously not that important, but you can go there if you're entertained by seeing me play chess online. I don't know why you would want to, but there it is if you want it. And I also have a playlist for my Matt Slick review series, which over the years I've had a number of conversations with Matt Slick. By now, most people who watch my channel probably know who that is. He's calls himself a Christian apologist, comes from the Reformed Calvinist perspective, and he has a live call-in show. And over a number of years, I called into him, had a number of conversations with him. And most of them I've just uploaded to my channel, but a number of them I have actually reviewed, because during the discussions, it's kind of hard for me to make my points because it's time constrained, and Matt, like a lot of people likes to control the conversation, so it's hard for me to really say what I want to say. But yeah, and over the time I've had these conversations with him, and I just feel like personally they're very instructive. It's not so much about Matt or me. It's really about the concepts. I really think Matt and I have talked about some really important things, and I think today is going to be no different. I think that this conversation is going to be a little bit different, and I'm not sure how people are going to if they're going to be really interested in it. But I think it's extremely important topic. And it's something else, but it's something a lot of people don't think about, and it's really more philosophical. What we're going to be discussing today is what's called epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how we can know what we know, and how do we justify knowledge? How can we, if we believe something is true, fundamentally ground it in absolute reality and say that this is true and not false? And can we analyze our belief systems and actually come to an understanding of how we know and we'll get into this, but I'm just trying to set the table for the conversation. We're gonna be getting into a debate that is going on within Christianity that deals with what's called presuppositionalism versus empirical rationalism, or there's basically 2 categories. There's presuppositionalism and there's non-presuppositionalism. And I'm going to define those terms. Non-presuppositionalism can be a number of things, and I hold to the view of what's called empirical rationalism. But the reason this is important is because I would say a vast majority, maybe definitely more than 90% of Christians, and I would say religious people in general, and just people in general, when it comes to their fundamental religious belief system, they are presuppositionalists. And what does that mean? Obviously it's the root word there is presuppose. they take their religious philosophy or perspective as a grounding and an absolute undisputable truth, and view everything else through that lens. And you would probably say, well, what else can a person do? What other possibility is there? Well, you could adopt the position that you shouldn't presuppose these things, which would go like, you think they're true, but they're not beyond being questioned because you can't really establish them based on a more fundamental level of justification, which would be like direct observation. So, for instance, an example that won't offend Christians. Take for example. They presuppose the truth of. Oh wait, what is? Okay, they presuppose the truth of the Quran. So what that leads to is a situation where the Quran is the foundation from which they view all other reality, and it is the thing that is not in question, whereas everything else is in question. What this leads to is a situation where these people who do that, not just Muslims, but we're using them as an example, are really blind to the possibility that what they believe might either be completely false or partially false. The Quran has an error in it, then psychologically they've restricted their mind from even entertaining that notion, and thus they are. And if anyone's watching and you hear audio issues, please let me know. They've basically put their mind in an arbitrary box, and they've said to themselves, "I'm just not going to question this." Well, but the problem is, other people are looking at the Quran and they're saying, "Okay, there's clearly a lot of problems here, and they're very evident for anyone who is looking at things objectively." And when you have conversations with people like this, what you'll notice is that no matter how decisively you prove what they believe to be in error or wrong or problematic, psychologically, in their mind, in the deepest part of their mind, they have blocked themselves from questioning this, and thus they are incapable of analyzing this in an objective manner, and thus they can't really they haven't what we want, what it is truly. I'll give another example. Is people who presuppose that the government is a force for good in society. So here's the thing: the government can be a good thing, but what if it's not? What if the people running the government, don't have your best interests in mind? What if let's say you have someone who has this mindset of the government's there to help you, and the government creates a plan and it destroys a whole bunch of people's lives and ruins society. And it just so happens that this plan that these government officials created, they get rich at the same time, and they get rich and powerful while everyone else in society is suffering. Well, someone who's presupposed that the government is a force for good in society at all times will have a hard time seeing that truth. Oh, they said they were trying to help us. They said they were doing it for our good. So, but someone who doesn't hold to that presupposition might say, well, look at what happened. They passed the law. It made things miserable for everybody, and they made a whole lot of money in the process. And why should we just presuppose that these people have our best interests in mind? So you can clearly see how presupposing things that shouldn't be presupposed can create real problems, because it prevents you psychologically from seeing the truth in an objective manner. And sadly, I have to say this, that's exactly what a lot of Christians do. They presuppose things that shouldn't be presupposed. And we're not going to talk about specifics, but what Matt and I are going to discuss is kind of... there's one more thing I have to say before we start the conversation, which you're going to hear Matt say a lot of things. And when I first heard him saying these things, I was wondering where he gets them from. And it turns out that the kinds of arguments Matt's going to be making here are very popular, like amongst like the more scholarly Christian theologians who like operate seminars and are like university professors and stuff. So it's kind of like you won't really hear your average Christian making these arguments, but these are the kind of things that you'll find in like Christian academic faculty lounges and stuff, which I think is important because those are the people who are training the pastors who go out and train Christians. So it does filter down. And the thing is, most people don't even know that they're getting this presuppositionalism because they just want to go in there and serve God, and they don't even realize what's going on. Most Christians would not, if you told them what, they don't know they're presuppositionalists. Most people just don't think about this. But the reason it's important, you need to question your presuppositions. You need to ask yourself, what are my presuppositions? If you don't ask yourself that, then you're not going to know what they are, and you're not going to know where you might be psychologically blocking yourself from seeing a deeper truth, which may be uncomfortable to you. But let's get started because I think I've said enough. We're already 10 minutes in and we haven't even started the conversation. And by the way, there are 2 conversations. So we're going to try and see if we can get through this in under, I'm going to say 2 hours. Let's go. Let's start the conversation.
Call. Let's get to Anthony from Virginia. Anthony, welcome. You're on the air.
Hey, Matt. Last week, I heard you in a conversation say something that really baffled me. That a person cannot know truth unless the infinite God reveals it to them. Now, was that a misstatement or an inaccurate statement, or is that what you meant to say?
Truth and ultimately.
All right, so I asked the question. This is from another conversation I had with Matt. You can actually go back and listen to the previous review I did. Matt made a very direct statement that humans can only know truth if God reveals it to them. There's no other way to know truth. And we're going to get into whether that's true or not. So first of all, what's Matt's answer to that question? Did he actually say that?
Truth can ultimately only be known if God reveals it to you. A person can accidentally know things that are true, but would have no way, apart from the Christian God, did have no way of knowing if their truth was an ultimate actuality or reality. They couldn't justify it. Okay.
So, can I know the truth that 2 + 2 is 4?
Yes. Yes, you can.
Okay.
And
so
an
I
atheist,
can know truth if God.
Yes, they can know those things. That's why I said ultimately they can't justify the truth. See, absolute truth, like for example, moral truths, can only be known if God reveals them to us. And 2 + 2 is 4 is based on the transcendental laws of logic. And the ultimate foundation for those is the very nature and existence of God.
So I'm going to say some controversial things here. Now, most people, when they heard Matt say those things, what he just said, I don't know if they agree with him or not. He said that things like 2 + 2 = 4 are based on the transcendental laws of logic, which must be rooted in the existence of an infinite God. And I'm gonna actually make the claim here that there actually are no, quote, laws of logic. And that's a very controversial position, and it would take a while to explain why I believe that. But the second part, that these things must be rooted in the existence of an infinite God. As a Christian, if you heard someone disagree with that, you would think, well, that's how can you be a Christian and deny that truth must be rooted in God or the existence of God? And I have to be very careful. I'm not arguing against the existence of God. I would argue against the idea that justification of truth and knowledge claims must be rooted in the presupposition that God exists. That is to say, whether 2 + 2 is 4 or anything else that's true is irrelevant not irrelevant, but it can be established apart from the question of whether God exists or not. So we can know truth, absolute truth, without having established that God exists. And that sounds like a really strange position for a Christian to take. But I want to let the conversation play out, and maybe we'll get into why I think that, and why I don't think it's an attack on God or anything.
And so ultimately, nobody can lay a basis for truth apart from the Christian theological perspective.
I don't see, as a Christian, I don't even believe that's true, because
okay, let's work with it.
There are things we can know that are logically true, based on everything we know about the universe and reality, and have nothing to do with God's revelation. So there are some truths that humans can know outside of God's revelation.
Well, I didn't say only through that revelation. So let's use 2 + 2 is 4. All right, it's true, right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you define for me what the number 2 is?
2 objects.
2 objects is number 2. So if I have 2 objects on my desk, is that the number 2?
Is concept of whatever's.
Whatever's?
The number.
So if you have 2 whatevers, that's what 2. So 2 only comes into existence when there are 2 whatevers there?
2 is a concept. It is a mental concept.
It's a concept. All right. Now, you're good. So the concept exists. Do we create the concept, or do we come in contact with the concept?
We create the concept.
So if we create the concept, then two-ness disappears when we die, right? Because it's dependent upon our mind. We create it. Therefore, there is no actuality of the number 2 in a transcendental sense. That means when we die, it ceases to have actuality, right? From your perspective so far. You see the problem?
Okay.
Do you see the problem so far?
So what Matt is trying to get me to do is to see that there's a problem with the idea that humans create the idea that 2 + 2 = 4. And at the time I was having this conversation, I thought he was just trying to lay a groundwork. And I was agreeing with the idea that 2 + 2 = 4 is a creation of the human mind. It doesn't exist beyond that. But what I didn't realize until he says, do you see the problem, is that Matt just doesn't believe that. And he was just trying to get me to think through this issue. Now, just kind of think about that. Is there a problem, just, before the conversation goes any farther, is there a problem with thinking that the idea that 2 + 2 = 4 is just something that solely exists in the human mind and has no basis in physical reality, or maybe even reality itself? Why would it be a problem to say that 2 + 2 = 4 only exists in the human mind, or a mind, a person's mind? And since only people can think about these things, obviously it's not going to be in the mind of, like, a rabbit or anything. So it's going to be in the mind of humans. Why is that a problem? And Matt's going to explain why it's a problem. And honestly, when he goes into his argument, I had never really heard this before, or I might have heard it a little bit, but I was really learning about this particular viewpoint during the course of this conversation. So I have a hard time. It takes me a while to get my mind around what he's actually trying to argue. But like I said, the reason this is relevant is because I thereafter discovered that this is a very popular viewpoint amongst evangelical Christian scholars. And it goes back to a guy who I believe lived in the mid-19th century named Cornelius Van Til, and probably farther than that. But it's there. Trust me, it's there, and it's affects the minds of a lot of people who teach Christianity at a scholarly level.
Are you there?
Well, the laws of logic do not depend on human.
There we go. Very good. So the number 2, we recognize it by the law of identity, which is something is what it is not what it is not. We recognize there's a concept called 2, just as there's a concept called 3. We don't take 2-ness and take a picture of it or weigh it. It's an abstraction, and you're right, it's in the mind. Good. Is it the product of your mind and my mind, or is it the product of your mind or my mind? In other words, is it dependent upon human mind, its actuality? If it's dependent upon human minds for actuality, how then does it have transcendent qualities? If it has a universal aspect of two-ness, then it exists whether or not you and I exist.
So did you hear what Matt just said there? If 2 plus 2 equals 4 is the product of human minds, then how does it have the quality or essence of transcendence? And this gets into what is called the transcendental argument for God, which is the idea that abstractions, true abstractions, are transcendent and universal. And I'm going to tell you right now that that is not true. There are no transcendentals. There are no... yeah, Samantha, you're going to be confused for a little while, but I'm going to try and walk us through what he's saying. Because this isn't something Matt Slick is making up. This is something he's learned. And this is something that people like Matt Slick, who are presuppositionalists, use to justify their error in their teaching. And you're going to see that. It's kind of hard to say what's going to happen in the rest of the conversation, which is why it's kind of hard to critique this discussion until you've heard the entire thing. But we're going to walk through these things. What Matt Slick has just told, is trying to get us to walk into, is what's called the transcendental argument for God. And the reason it's called that is because it's based on the idea that abstractions and concepts, like mathematical concepts, are transcendental and have real existence of their own. And the problem is, I guess the problem is that that's just not true. There is no transcendental number 2 that exists beyond the human mind. The number 2 in all numbers and all abstractions, 2 is just one example, but it could be anything. Could be an abstraction, could be the idea of a pencil or the idea of a nickel. These are abstractions because they are concepts in the human mind. When you think of abstraction, just think of ideas in people's minds or concepts. And the transcendental argument for God says that these ideas exist beyond the human mind in a universal, in a manner that is universal, and which unites all the instantiations of the individual manifestations of the transcendentals on Earth. And if you didn't understand what I just said, trust me, we're going to get into that, and it's going to become more clear. But the first time you hear these arguments, it can be very confusing. But before we go forward, I want people to know this. Every single thing Matt is saying right now is derived from Platonic, Greek, and Aristotelian philosophy. And by that I mean, if you go back and I'm not expecting anyone to do this, but if you're interested, you can do it. And you go look at what Plato taught. Who's Plato? Plato is an ancient Greek philosopher. He lived about 400 years before Jesus Christ. And Plato, believe it or not, taught basically the exact same arguments Matt is going to be using. The only difference is that Matt, and if you go investigate Plato and read what he taught to his disciples or his students or whatever, you will see that what Matt is going to say in this conversation is exactly the same thing, but and some other Greek philosophers too. But what Matt does and what some other Christians do is they slap on Christian terms to the Greek philosophy to basically dress it up as Christianity. So what Matt does, see, you remember that the verse in the Bible that says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word, what is it? The Word was with God, and the Word was God. that word is actually logos. And Plato, according to Plato, the logos, and Plato called it the logos because Plato is Greek. Logos is a Greek word. Plato basically conceived as the logos as God. The logos was the creative mind behind the origin of the universe. And this is something a lot of Christians just don't know. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that you're going to hear Matt use Plato's argument, but instead of ending it with, and that proves the logos of Plato, you're going to hear Matt say it proves the trinitarian God of Christianity. We'll get into it. Let's just keep going. And if you're getting confused, trust me, it's the conversation's going to be very interesting for people who, and like I said, we're not going to be really analyzing the Bible this time. I know a lot of people who watch my channel usually like to see biblical analysis. No, this is going to be straight philosophy. There's going to be very little biblical analysis going on. We're going to be talking about philosophy and very little. So if that doesn't interest you, then I'm sorry, this video isn't going to interest you. But for those of you who are willing, who want to think about, coming at truth from a deeper perspective, you can learn a lot from this conversation. So let's keep going.
And we'll get on the break. I'll continue with this. All right, we'll show you. All right, buddy, hold on, man. Hey, folks, we'll be right back after these. All right, buddy, welcome back to the show. Anthony, are you still there?
Yes.
All right, you with me so far about the issue of what the abstract concept of two is?
Yeah, okay. I'm busy with their concepts. All right, how is that related to we can only know them if God reveals them to us?
Well, because, for one thing, God is revealing it to all people. Yet, this is a lot of, I'll just do it this way. So two-ness is an abstraction that is universal, and it does not change.
All right, agreed.
Abstractions require a mind.
Right.
I just said I agree in this conversation. I no longer agree with what Matt just said. There is no two-ness essence that exists beyond the human mind, and it's not transcendental and it's not universal. And I'll let me just quickly explain why, folks. Because the reason two is a bad example is because it's a very easily understood concept, and everyone basically has the same idea of what two is because it's so easy to understand what two is. But the key to realize is that's only because humans can very easily understand the concept of two, and thus we all form approximately the same understanding of the number two. It's something that a child can do. But you can imagine like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old not understanding the concept of two because their minds haven't been trained to understand what two is. So it's not universal to that person's mind. And you can kind of think about it like maybe a person with a mental situation, underdeveloped or whatever you want to call it, they might not be able to really understand two either. Maybe, or a very, a very shaky understanding of it. If, their situation is kind of severe. But if you think about, like, let's take a more advanced concept, like a car. Well, Matt is going to argue that there's a transcendental universal notion or abstraction called carness, which unites all people's understandings of car. But the thing is, the idea of car is unique to each individual depending on their personal perspective. When I say the word car, what I think in my mind as a car is completely different from probably what you're thinking. I'm probably thinking of my car that I own. And you might think of the car that you own, and that's what you initially think of as car. But let's take another example. Let's say I'm not an auto mechanic. But if you say the word car to an auto mechanic, his understanding of the word car is going to be very different from your average person's because they actually know all the parts of a car. And their understanding of the word car is far deeper and more nuanced and detailed than your average person, because most people haven't studied cars and they don't know all the different parts and how it all works and it's fit together. But a car mechanic does. So the same word So the same word, car, when it's more complicated, you can easily see how different people come to different ideas of what these things are depending on their different perspectives. But two is so easy that everyone basically forms the same idea in their mind because it's so simple. Leave Uncle Matt alone? Well, if he's on the radio teaching people things that aren't true, I feel like I'm, I have the right to criticize him, Faithful Theology. But that's funny. All right, so this is why you have to understand when Matt is going into this idea of why two is a universal and transcendent, that he's wrong. I know you're being silly, Faithful Theology. I know. There are no transcendentals. There are only concepts that people create in their minds, and they may either correspond to reality or they may not. But they're not universal and they're not transcendent because they're based on our own observations of reality, and that's how we form these concepts in our mind. But let's keep going because we don't want to spend all day here.
Since the nature of the abstractions are logical, they are universal, they're invariant, that it implies a mind that's abstract, universal, and invariant, right?
Okay. Well,
that can only
not
be
necessarily.
Yes. Otherwise, you have an abstract entity that exists apart from God. How is that possible? And this is where the atheists.
The answer to that one is there are no abstract entities that have any existence. They don't have an existence. They only exist within our mind. When our mind disappears, when we die or whatever, the abstraction disappears. There's no transcendental, ethereal, Platonic concept or abstraction.
Stub their intellectual toes.
That's the key to understanding the flaw in Matt's argument.
The function of the human mind is to create concepts. So these concepts are things that we create in our minds by observing the universe around us and forming these concepts in our minds. So,
but your problem with that is
at no juncture is it necessary to postulate that God revealed any of this information.
You're not listening. You're not hearing what I'm saying, though. Ultimately, okay. And so we only observe what is actual. They're not dependent upon our minds. So even the atheists can observe the idea of numbers, but these numbers are not dependent upon the physical universe, because if they were, they'd be properties of the physical universe. But properties are measurable: heat, mass, volume, color, refraction. Properties are measurable. The laws of logic, laws of numbers are not measurable. There's no machines.
The reason they're not measurable is because they're properties of the mind, and the mind is immaterial. So you heard Matt say that these are not properties of the universe. That's correct. They're not properties of the material, physical universe. They're properties of our minds. And that's it. If there wasn't a mind, these abstractions wouldn't exist.
Measure them, no spectrographs,
right?
No scales.
Okay.
All right, so they're not the same thing or properties of the universe. They're independent of it, and yet they are universal and abstract. The necessary.
No, they are not universal, and they are not. Well, they are abstract, but they're not universal.
Precondition for that is a universal mind. Now I won't get into this now. We could get into one of the many and the particular instance and manifestations, particular instances of the number two versus its universal concept. I won't get into that because it's too much for here. But that ultimately is answered only in the Trinitarian foundation. I won't get into that either right now. It's too much.
So you heard Matt say that. That's ultimately only answered in the Trinitarian foundation. Now, if you have time and you want to, go read Plato and Platonic philosophy. And what you're going to find is that at the end of Plato's arguments, he postulates that he has proven the existence of the Logos, which is his concept of God. What Matt does is, like I said earlier, all he does is he chops off Plato's Logos and he slaps on the Christian Trinitarian God. If you go investigate Plato, I guarantee you're going to find out that you are going to be shocked at how similar Matt's arguments are to what Plato taught.
So the thing is that though an atheist can know accidentally that 2 plus 2 is 4, he can't ground that knowledge in his atheistic presuppositions. It can only be grounded in the Trinitarian Christian worldview. So I'm not saying that.
I actually disagree with that. And
well, you're incorrect then.
Well, I'm not, because
yes, you are.
If an atheist can determine that 2 plus 2 is 4, then it doesn't have to be grounded in anything. It's just grounded in the truth of what it is.
So then what you're saying is that people can have things that they affirm that's not grounded. In other words, it's not for any reason. So
all right, well,
wait a second.
So
Anthony, hold on. You said it doesn't have to be grounded in anything. If something is not grounded in anything, then it means it's arbitrary.
No.
That's actually a true statement, and I actually misspoke there. I should have said it's grounded outside of the Christian Trinitarian God existence.
Yes.
Well, yes,
grounding.
Yes, that's true. But
okay.
Yes, that is a true statement.
So let me ask you,
Anthony.
Anthony, can an atheist ground or provide any necessary preconditions that would account for the universality of the laws of logic and numbers? The answer is no.
And notice he's throwing up this straw man where he's talking about atheists. I don't know why he's doing that. He knows I'm not an atheist, and I'm not arguing this from an atheist perspective. So every time you hear Matt say atheists can't do this, okay, well maybe they can't, but I don't care about the atheists right now, because I think they're wrong too. I'm speaking at this from a purely theistic perspective.
They can't.
I think they kind of can, because
no, they kind of can't. No, they can't. Because what they will do is beg the question. They will assume the validity of the laws and say they're related to our mind and or to the properties of the universe, or that they're universal abstraction that just have a quality of existence. Then what they do is they get into what's called propositions. Propositions are true entities that have no properties, but yet they're existing.
I think the only
Don't worry about all that. It's meaningless, and he's talking about atheists. Don't even. It's ridiculous to. Yeah, it's meaningless because I'm not talking about atheism. I'm not trying to argue from an atheistic perspective.
The only thing you have to do is postulate the existence of a mind. So if humans have minds, however you define that, then there's no need to go beyond that.
Yes, there is a need to go beyond it, because your mind and my mind are not the foundations for the laws of logic. Something
actually they are. They are.
Beyond our minds is. So therefore, we have to have some other source. We don't determine what truth is. We discover what truth is.
Okay, something else you said I disagree with is the Christian Trinitarian God. The pagans were able to determine mathematical truths, and they never conceived of the Christian
I understand that.
Trinitarian God.
You're not hearing me. You are not listening to me. I'll say it again. They can discover these things. They can't ultimately ground them outside the Trinitarian God. There's a big difference.
So what Matt's trying to do here is this is the problem I have with what Matt is doing. He's using it to say that you can't justify any knowledge or any truth outside of the Trinitarian conceptualization of God. So what he's trying to do here is shoehorn his view of the Trinity and say that it is the foundation, the absolute basis of all knowledge and truth. And thus, if you don't believe in the Trinity, that means you cannot justify any truth claim. That's the danger of what Matt's doing here. It took me a while to get here, but I want you to understand that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to make the Trinity the basis of all reality, beyond which you cannot know or justify any truth. And that's very, very dangerous. If the Trinity is not true, which I think there are a lot of reasons to believe it's not. But he's trying to basically take his particular view of God and make it the grounding of all truth. But you think, well, how could someone do that? Well, a lot of people fall for this. They think it sounds really sophisticated and intelligent, but when you realize the trick that's being played, it's very easy to see through. So that's why I'm explaining this to people, because people hear this and they think, wow, yeah, the Trinity, I guess you can't know anything unless the Trinity is true. You have to believe in the Trinity, or there's no ability to know what we know. That's a very serious and it's a claim that is unjustified and leads to people thinking that they have to base their views on an unjustified presupposition, which I think is a huge problem in Christianity. And that's why I'm doing this video, to show people that they shouldn't be doing that.
It does not mean they can't discover trigonometry or understand certain moral absolutes, but defending them as universals and providing the necessary precondition for intelligibility, they cannot do. I've had countless discussions over the decades on this topic, which is why it sounds odd, why I can talk like this, and I'm not even getting deep, because I have gotten very deep with people. I just want to do that in the radio. But you have to understand, there's a concept or an issue called the one and the many. For example, we'll do this to the break, and then
he just talked about the one and the many. I want people to understand, once again, the one and the many issue is a pagan Greek philosophical concept. The Greek pagan philosophers, including Plato, but a number of others, were the first ones to talk about what is called the problem of the one and the many. And if you do an internet search, you will quickly find out that that's true. And so the fact that Matt thinks that the one and the many is something that is something that how should I say this? That proves his view of Christianity. It's silly. One reason you know it's silly is because the Greeks were talking about the one and the many, and they were proving their views of God with it hundreds of years before Christianity ever existed. And it's a pagan philosophical concept. People don't understand that Matt Slick, who claims to be a Christian apologist, is basing his worldview on Greek pagan philosophy. That's exactly what he's doing. And I'm exposing him for anyone who's willing to listen anyways.
We'll move on. So I used the word a chair. You can have multiple chairs.
Here we go. He's going to talk about how if you think about a chair, there's two levels to think about it. There's the idea called chairness, which is like this ideal transcendental idea of chair that exists like in some sort of mystical spiritual realm around us that allows us to tap into it. And then there's chairs on earth. And the chairs on earth, each one of them gets its essence from the universal concept of chair. People, I'm telling you, this is exactly what Plato taught. These are called Platonic ideals. Look up on the internet, or if you want to go to a library, you're free to do that as well. Look up Platonic ideals. What you're going to find in Platonic essences, you will find that Plato used these very points to prove his perspective about the Logos. This is new. Let's see here. What does this say? This is new information to me, although I did find out about the Plato and the Trinity concept about last year. Trinity never made sense to me, even. Yeah. Believe it or not, Samantha, the early... here's the problem, Samantha. A lot of Christians don't want to acknowledge this, but at the time that Jesus Christ was on the earth, the religion of the Mediterranean region, if you want to call it that, it wasn't... I guess you could call it a religion, but it was also a philosophy. The most popular philosophy / religion of that time period in that entire area, was Greek philosophy, specifically Plato's philosophy. And guess what? Guess what Plato called his his view of God? Logos. And guess what Plato talked, and the Greek philosophers talked a lot about? Essences. Or another way of saying essences is substances. Now, when you hear the Trinitarians, what are they always talking about? How the Trinity is three persons that are co-equal in their nature and co-substantial in their substances. The Trinity is based, the language of the Trinity is based on Greek philosophical concepts and terms. And the reason for this is many of the people who are converting to Christianity and thus becoming leaders in the Christian movement, guess where they converted from? Greek pagan Platonic philosophy. And they were importing their Platonic ideas into Christianity. And those people became the ones who developed the Trinity idea. And part of the Trinity, one of the most important aspects of the Trinity is that the Father and the Son are co-substantial. And the substances of the universe is something the Greek philosophers were debating centuries before Jesus Christ walked the earth. And what the Christian converts did, what these Greek philosophers who converted to Christianity did, was they replaced the logos of Plato with, guess what? The logos of Jesus Christ. And the reason they could do that was because the logos was co-substantial with the Father. Co-substantial. They were the divine substance, the divine essence. They were, you heard the word quintessence. They were, the Greek philosophers were looking for the fundamental essence or substance of the universe. You have some who thought it was water. There's some who thought it was fire. There's some who thought it was air. There were some who thought it was let's see, what are earth, whatever it is, solids, what, I don't remember them all. But there were four big ones. And then they came up with, well, there must be a fifth one. Fifth in Greek is quint, the quintessence, the fundamental essence of the universe. The logos, the Platonic logos became the quintessence, the fifth essence of the universe. The fifth substance that was the substance that made up all other substances. And Jesus and the Father were basically co-substantial, and they became the fundamental essence of all things in their modified version of Christianity. This is really, really amazing stuff. When you understand it, and when you know this history, you can let me actually hold on. Let me do something, folks. This is actually worth taking some time to. I think this is even in the Nicene Creed. You can see shades of this. Let me look at this real fast. Here it is. Yep. Let's look at this. Sorry if I'm losing you folks, but this is really important stuff. Most people don't know about this stuff. This is why I'm here, trying to help everyone else out. This is the Nicene Creed. This is. Oh, let me get rid of this real fast. Sorry. Let me. Where is it? There it is. Yeah, this is. The Nicene Creed is basically the first real Trinitarian creed, and it came in the year 325 in what's called the Council of Nicaea, which is why it's called the Nicene Creed. And the Council of Nicaea was called by Emperor Constantine, who is himself a pagan convert to Christianity. And what you're going to see here, folks, I want you to read this. This is too big. All right, let's read this. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. I believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. This word right here, consubstantial, is a dead giveaway that they were importing Greek philosophical concepts into Christianity and making it the basis of the Trinitarian doctrine. Why would you? So you're going to say, why would you say that? Well, because go back and read the Greeks, the Greek philosophers. They talked about substances for centuries and centuries and centuries, and then all of a sudden, one of the most important creeds in Christian history has this very important Greek point of discussion right there in the foundation of the Trinitarian worldview. That doesn't raise questions for people. I'm not, not you who are listening, but the reason this doesn't raise questions for people is most people don't know this. Look at the same creed in the Anglican Church. All right, I have not looked at that yet. Let me do a little search real fast. Anglican Church, Nicene Creed. Never done this before. churchofengland.org. So this is what I got from churchofengland.org. All it is seen in that we believe in Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. Okay, so they change it. That's interesting. I guess that would be like one essence with the Father, maybe. And through him were all things made. Okay, that's interesting. Hey, Chris Lucas. Good to see you. Yeah, so that was a little sidetrack. Good question, Samantha. I don't know if you're still there or not, but all right, let's keep going with the conversation. This is really, really interesting stuff, folks.
Building in us. But there's one concept called chair, and there's particular manifestations of chairness. A chair. You can have multiple chairs in a building, in an office. But there's one concept called chair, and there's particular manifestations of chairness. So which one is ultimate? The particular manifestations or the one concept? Which is the ultimate, which means it is the ultimate source of the other.
Again, folks, it sounds complicated and it sounds kind of like sophisticated, but it's gobbledygook. It's just it's false presupposition upon false presupposition. There's no chairness. Chairs on earth aren't manifestations of a transcendental abstraction called chairness, or a Platonic ideal called chairness. Believe it or not, Plato had a very famous student called Aristotle. And Aristotle came along and he disagreed with Plato. He's like, all this stuff is made up. There's no need to think that there's this Platonic realm where we get our ideas. We just look at a chair and we call it a chair. Because that's what our minds do. They look at things, they observe them, and they generate the concepts in their mind. Take away language and what is left. Yeah, good question.
So if chairness is the ultimate source, then how do you unite it to the particular manifestations? If the particular manifestations are the ultimate, how do you unite it with the concept of universal chairness? In the Christian Trinitarian presupposition, the one and the many exists naturally in God himself, one being in three distinct simultaneous persons. So the one and the many concept are there, and we can answer the question where the unbelievers cannot, because the atheist don't have a universal mind to which they can appeal. And those who hold to certain God concepts can appeal to a God, but then they can't solve the one and the many thing apart from the Trinitarian presupposition.
How would you respond to a Muslim saying, well, you can't know ground 2 plus 2 unless you believe in Allah? So how are you different from the Muslim who makes that argument?
Well, then we get into the issue. There's two ways to do that, but I'll get into the simple one. Then I will ask about the one and the many issue, which is ultimate in their theological.
So he's going to try to prove his view of Christianity using an argument that was developed by pagan Greek philosophers centuries before Jesus Christ. Do you see the problem here?
Perspective as it relates to their false god, Allah.
And I'm speaking obviously of the problem of the one and the many. Go look up the problem of the one and the many. The Greeks were debating that way before Christianity existed, centuries before.
Ultimate, the thing that unites, or the particulars of that thing. What is it, the ultimate? This is sophisticated discussion, and the average Joe's not ready for it, and the average Muslim is.
Well, I think you're just arbitrarily defining the ground of being as your conceptualization of God.
No, I'm not.
Instead of just saying, well, you are. Because
no, I'm not. It's not arbitrary.
There's no rational link between the ground of 2 plus 2 is 4 is the Trinitarian Christian God.
Yes, there is. Because 2
doesn't mean there's not a. It doesn't mean there's not a Christian God.
I'll explain. 2 is a single.
All right, my dinner's ready. I gotta go. Sorry, man. I'll call some other time.
Wow. Okay.
Actually, I forgot I did that. I was cooking dinner at the time, and I heard the little alarm bell go off, and that was actually kind of rude. I probably shouldn't have done that. I probably should have said, like, I just said I got to run, but that's actually what happened. I was cooking dinner at the time, and the little bell went off, and then but whatever. That's probably shouldn't have done that.
So this often happens when it gets tough for people. So let me explain before the break. 2 is a single concept that people all over the world can simultaneously conceive of. 2 is a single concept, but it has particular manifestations in different minds on the planet at the same time. So which is ultimate? Which is the final thing beyond which and upon which the concept of 2-ness rests? Is it in the particular number 2? But then how do you justify and relate the occurrences of the concept 2-ness in different minds? If 2-ness in different minds is ultimate, then how do you unify them across multiple minds? This is a philosophical conundrum. It's been discussed for 3,000 years. And the philosophers can't answer it. Enter Trinitarianism, the one and the many, the one concept of God with 3 simultaneous distinct persons. In his essence and in his nature is the universality and the multiplicity of existence. The one and the many issue can exist in God, who is ubiquitous. So the concept of 2, for example, exists in the mind of God, and he reveals it in creation and to us, being made in his image. We can think God's thoughts after him. Therefore, God is the ultimate and not a concept. So God is the ultimate, and he's the source of 2-ness. And since he's transcendent and we are made in his image, we can then apprehend, comprehend, and use the concept of 2 in different places at different times simultaneously. If you go with just a Muslim God, the one being, you can't differentiate between the quality of 2 and the manifestations beyond or of them, of that concept. And that gets into more complicated stuff. I know this is pretty heady for a lot of people, so I don't get into it very often on radio, but these are the kinds of discussions I have on a semi-regular basis with atheists and others. We get into this kind of stuff, and I enjoy it particularly. Hey, we'll be right back after these messages. 3 open lines, 877.
So I want to recap a little bit, because that last few minutes there after I kind of left, he kind of summed up his entire argument. And I want people to understand something. You may have never heard anything like what Matt just said, but I wonder, and this is something I said at the beginning for those of you who weren't there, this is the kind of theology that you're going to find in your seminary school faculty lounge, evangelical seminary. This is not Matt Slick making something up that no one's ever heard before and doesn't have any influence on Christianity at large. It really does. And I want to emphasize what I'm going to say again. If you go and just listen to what he said in that last couple minutes there is no difference between the arguments he makes to justify his view of the Trinitarian God and the arguments that Plato and the Greek philosophers made to justify their belief in the divine logos. None. It's all there. Hundreds of years before Jesus Christ. Non-Christian doctrine. What does Matt Slick do, and what do people like him do? What they do is they take the exact same arguments from the Greek philosophers. They cut out the Greek labels, and they replace the Greek things that they cut out with Christian terminology. So the arguments are the same. The idea of a transcendental Platonic realm where the essences of all things in existence are existing and which form the basis for the material world. So you heard Matt talk about a couple of things. Chairs, but it could, or the number 2, but it could literally be anything. Anything that you observe in existence. And in my room, I'm in a house. There's a Platonic ideal for house. Computer. Car, like I said. Anything. According to the Platonists, there's a heaven, basically, you can think about it, or a spiritual reality beyond us, where these things exist in, we got Josh here, polytheistic Canaanite basis that became monotheistic over time. Yeah, basically. Yeah, that's correct. What the Greeks said was that this Platonic realm exists, and the things that exist in this world are imperfect manifestations of this Platonic perfect realm. So when you see a chair, there's a perfect chairness, substance, essence in this, ideal reality that chair you're looking at is a manifestation of. The problem is, folks, there's absolutely no reason to propose this perfect Platonic realm to explain or justify the existence of the chair and a truth claim that our understanding of the chair can be known apart from this. So what's happening, folks, is that humans are not getting their ideas universally from a universal, transcendental, Platonic realm. What's going on? What's going on is when we are developing as humans from toddlers, we are observing the world around us. As humans, we have a mind. Now, the atheists are going to have a problem with this because according to atheism, there really is no such thing as the mind. The mind is purely a product of physical and chemical processes in the brain. So you actually don't have a mind that actually exists as some sort of thing that does stuff. It's just an illusion produced by chemicals in your brain. So the atheists, they're going to have a much harder time arguing with Matt than I am. But as someone who believes in the subsistence of an independent, substantial mind, whatever that is, what we have as humans is a mind. And this mind is actually the basis of our decision-making process. This shouldn't be very surprising. But our mind, one of the things it does is as we're going around, as we're growing up, our senses are perceiving the world around us. And let's say we look at the chair. So we're 2 years old or we're 3 years old, and we look at the chair, and then what do our parents do? Our little baby fingers point and go, gaga goo goo. And then what do your parents do? They say, that's a chair. That's a chair. Or the dog. You point at you're a little baby, you point at the dog and you mumble something incoherent, And then your parents go, dog, that's a dog. And then your little baby mouth goes, daga, or something like that. It says something that's closer to dog. Your mind over time is developing these concepts. And by the time, you're an adult, dog is a very well understood concept. But when you're an infant, you've only seen one dog. So you think that's what all dogs look like. But when you get older, you've seen thousands of dogs. So your concept of dog knows that there's not just one kind of dog. There's tons of different types of dogs, and they all fit within the category that's been created in your mind called dog. And that's true of literally everything you observe. So your mind, what it does is it creates these shortcuts where you have concepts in your mind that are reflective of what you observe in reality. So everything, all of these things, the number 2, chair, car, dog, they exist in your mind because you've observed them as you're growing up. And you've created these concepts. And that's why when you look at the number 2, everyone understands what 2 plus 2 is 4. And Matt will say, well, everyone knows 2 plus 2 is 4. So that means it's transcendental and universal. Okay, what about when you start getting to like calculus and all these really complicated, mathematical formulas and stuff that barely anybody understands? Well, how is Matt going to argue that it's universal and transcendental? Because nobody really understands it except the mathematicians. So what you see is a breakdown where the concepts are not the people who understand them are the people who've dedicated their lives to understanding them, and they've utilized their minds in a way that the concepts in their mind are very easy for them to understand because they've been researching them and learning about them over and over and over for their entire lives, and that's why they can teach calculus to a college room full of college students, auditorium or whatever, because they spent their lives thinking about these concepts. But most people haven't done that, so the concepts are very vague and nebulous to them if they're understood at all. So when you understand that there's no basis for this idea that there are transcendentals and universals, then Matt's entire argument just completely falls apart. And the same thing goes with the laws of logic. Now, I'm going to make a controversial statement, and you're going to think to yourself, how can that be? How can there be truth if he says something like that? But just listen. There actually are no laws of logic. There are no laws of logic. Which is why think about a real law, like the law of gravity. If I jump up in the air and I don't have a jetpack, I'm going to fall back down to the earth. If someone on the other side of the earth jumps up in the air, they're going to fall back down to the earth. If I go to the other side of the universe and I'm on another planet and I jump up in the air and it's like Earth, guess what? I'm going to fall back down to that planet. So that the laws of physics are actually transcendental and universal. But when it comes to concepts and logical processes, these are not universal by any means. And that's why there are very illogical people out there. Because imagine this. Imagine saying that there's a law, like a law of gravity. How should I do this? If you want to say it's a law, think about it like a real law. The law of gravity applies to all people at all times. But the laws of logic don't apply to all people in all times. Well, why is that? Because they're not actually laws. There's no law. There's no law governing your mind or your thought process that brings you to the logical basis of whatever it is you're trying to investigate. What has to happen is what's going on here is that there's a reality around us that has been created by God, in my opinion, or that's my belief. But we'll ignore that for now. The point is there's a reality. Let's just say that. Your ideas will either correspond to reality or they will not correspond to reality. And that's what makes what you believe true or not, if it corresponds to reality. So let's just say, you have two people trying to figure out what's real and unreal. One of them says gravity exists, and they're both standing at the edge of a very tall building. One of them believes in the concept that gravity exists, and if you jump off the building, you're going to fall down, and you're probably going to get hurt very badly. Another person, says, well, I don't believe in gravity because it just doesn't make sense. And believe it or not, there are people who don't believe in gravity, but they're out there. Trust me. They don't believe. They think it's, well, they're out there. Not very many of them, but let's just ignore that. Well, what's going to happen? That person can believe gravity doesn't exist all he wants, but when he jumps off that building, the problem for him is that gravity does exist, and his concept of reality was wrong, and he's going to fall to the bottom of the building. And this can be applied to the Christian perspective. Let's take the free gracers. There is a reality of how God is going to judge us. What God's standard is what God's standard is. Now, what people believe about how God is going to judge us does not change the reality of how God is going to judge us. So if people think that they're going to be judged by grace, which means all they have to do is put their faith in whatever it is they have to put their faith in, and that their lives don't matter, or their actions and their behavior and their obedience doesn't matter, well, what's going to happen to them when they die and their soul is standing before God and their concept of what's real isn't correct, and they are being judged by their obedience and their righteousness? It's not going to be a very pleasant moment for them. That's what I believe. So it's very important but why do they believe that? Well, they've presupposed that they are reading, first of all, assuming they've interpreted the scriptures they are reading properly, which is not obviously a given. Well, they presuppose the Holy Spirit has given them the interpretation. Let's start there. These people think to themselves, well, I've put my faith in Jesus, and that means I have the Holy Spirit. And that means the Holy Spirit has guided me to believe what I believe. So I'm not wrong about my interpretation. That's for darn sure. Okay, that's a presupposition that is not based on observations of reality and facts. It's something they feel. And so once you get the interpretation down, even if their interpretation is correct, it still may not be true ultimately. The words in the book could very well correspond to what they believe. But is what the book is telling them true? Well, really, they don't know. And that's why this whole idea of assurance of salvation, quote unquote, assurance, you want assurance? Everybody wants assurance of salvation. People, it's an illusion. There's no way to have assurance of salvation. Because even if you want to argue that you're promised assurance of salvation in the book you read, you have no guarantee that the book you read is ultimately true. And that's assuming that your interpretation of the book you read is true, which that's obviously in dispute too. And the reason they trick themselves into thinking their interpretation is correct is because they presuppose that people of their particular religious persuasion actually have the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is making sure that they're getting these really important things right. But the Holy Spirit is telling them that they don't have to obey God. That should be a red flag right there. The Holy Spirit is God, and it's telling them that they don't have to obey God to be in right relationship with God. Right there, we're starting to ask questions. Maybe God, the Holy Spirit isn't telling me that I shouldn't be obeying God. You see what I'm saying? Now, this is a 2-day conversation, so if you want to stick around, I'm going to start the second video. I can't remember exactly what it said, but I think it's a continuation of this one, and we're going to keep going. Maybe we won't watch the whole thing, but we'll watch a little bit more of it. But that was January 24th. Okay, so this is the next day. So the next day I call in, and we're going to watch this. It's about 15 minutes long too, but maybe we might not watch the whole thing. I think some important things are discussed here. You feel free to stick around as long as you want. You're not obligated to be here.
Anthony from Virginia, welcome. You're on the air.
Hey, Matt, I called yesterday and I had to run early, but you were explaining how all knowledge must be rooted in the presupposition that the Christian Trinitarian God exists.
Yes. And
even as a Christian, I find that a highly just false statement based on pure logic. But would you want to
no. Wait. Based on pure logic, you're wrong. See, when you say based on pure logic, what you're saying is that you understand logic purely and completely, and that's why it's wrong. And then you don't say wrong citing anything in logic. You say, go on. Now, you're the guy who if I remember correctly, you don't even believe Jesus Christ is God in flesh who died on the cross, rose from the dead, right? Is that right?
Oh, I'm willing to entertain the notion, but this is another subject.
Yeah,
so.
I just want people to know that you're not a true believer and that you're arguing from a non-biblical, non-regenerate perspective. So,
non-regenerate
cannot ground their knowledge, their logic, or their morality outside the Christian Trinitarian view. They can try to, but they can't. They always have weaknesses in their arguments. There's no ultimate standard and grounding. Okay.
So how do you let's go back to the example of mathematics. Why does one need to presuppose the existence of the Christian Trinitarian God to know basic mathematical truth?
See, again,
there's no logical basis for that.
Again, you're not listening. And I told you yesterday, you're not.
To be fair, Matt is correct here. I was having a very hard time understanding what he was saying, and that led to me asking the same question and making the same mistake over and over again. So I can kind of understand Matt's frustration here a little bit.
Not listening to what I'm saying to you. So let me say it again. I am not saying they can't understand basic math or basic logic, even as an atheist. I'll tell you again, they can do that. They are able to do that, okay? So don't say that I'm saying they can't. They can. What I'm saying is they have no ultimate justification or grounding for their position. They can believe certain things that happen to be correct, but they can't ground the beliefs in their system of thought.
They can't conceptualize the idea that if they put two objects with two other objects,
you are not. Okay, I want you to do me a favor.
Now Matt's going to play his little games here, which is a waste of time and pretty annoying. But at the same time, like I said, I really was not comprehending what he was saying because the argument was new to me at the time. Now I can look back and see like what he was actually trying to say and why he was getting so frustrated with me.
Okay. Seriously, take your right hand, and I want you to put it in front of your face, okay? Vertical. I don't think you can see me on the screen. And what I want you to do, Anthony, what I want you to do is take your right hand and put it vertical in front of your face. Can you do that for me really fast? Can you?
All right, let me ask you this.
Can you do that?
All right, I just did it.
Okay, wait a second. Anthony, stop it. I want you to take your right hand, put it vertical in front of your face. Okay? Now, can you look to your left? All right. Now, can you slap yourself upside the head? Okay?
Okay.
You don't listen.
Last question.
You don't listen. And I have to say it.
I misspoke.
You don't.
I misspoke.
You don't.
I wanted to ask
Anthony, I'll mute you if you don't stop. I'm trying to tell you. You don't listen to what I say. So many times the unbelievers like you hear what they want to hear and don't listen. Unbelievers cannot give any ultimate grounding for what they hold to regarding the laws of logic, mathematics, morality, or our existence. They have no ultimate standard, no terminus that beyond which nothing exists. Pick one little topic, and I'll show you.
Yeah, I want to disagree with that statement. Can they ground it on their observations of reality?
And what is reality? Anthony, what is reality and what are they assuming? Because they're assuming the laws of logic when they identify things around them. So they're presupposing the law of identity, what grounds their right to have the law of identity. If they say it's because they observe it, then they're begging the...
There's no law of identity. The concepts in your mind either correspond to reality or they don't. There's no transcendental law of identity that exists. You will hear many philosophers talk about the laws of logic. And my position is kind of a minority, but I'm quite certain I'm correct. I don't believe that the laws of logic actually exist. That doesn't mean people can't be logical. Being logical to me is just having ideas that conform to the truth or reality as it is. That's what logic is. It's making sure that your beliefs, concepts, and ideas correspond to the external reality around us and how things would work or do work when you start to try to think about how things interact with one another.
Question. You're just saying that their senses see it, but they don't see the laws of logic. They have to conclude them. So apart from epistemological issues dealing with the idea of learning through your senses, you have to adopt rationalism. But then what version of rationalism are they going to use? And how are they going to ground it? See, you don't understand the issues. We have a break, so hold on. We'll be right back after these messages. Please stay tuned. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Let's get right back on with Anthony for a little bit more. Anthony, are you there?
Yes.
There's a difference between using something and grounding the use of it or justifying it. They can say 2 + 2 = 4, but you don't understand enough of the issues to be able to argue about it. I mean that politely, but it's true. They can understand the concept of 2 as well as addition and summation, but what they're doing is begging the question: how do they recognize the universality of the number 2 and totality, summation? How do they recognize it? What justifies the universal of 2-ness in their worldview? These are the kinds of questions they can't answer. They just work with.
They can.
No, they can't. No, they can't.
Well, philosophers have long known that the function that's called the rational mind, it's one of what distinguishes humans from the animals, is that we have a rational mind. And what the rational mind does is generate concepts based on our observation. So there's no need to justify anything beyond.
Yeah, I've already gone over this. You don't listen. Where does the concept of 2 come from?
Our mind.
So you're the one, and I'm the one who invented the idea of 2-ness, right?
No, but
so then
it's something we generate.
Watch.
Develop in our mind.
Watch. Yeah, you don't get it. You're not listening. We don't start 2-ness.
See how he doesn't let me speak more than like half a sentence? That's how he wins these kinds of, he quote unquote wins his discussions.
In our minds, so therefore it's not of our minds, is it? It's not based on our minds or our thinking. If it's not on yours or mine, it's not on anybody's.
It is.
Oh, it is? Which human being mind is it that, Anthony, which human being mind is it that 2-ness has its origin?
All human minds that conceive of 2-ness possess that concept. There's nothing.
Where does the concept come from? Why is the concept universal?
It's grounded in our mental construct.
And by now you should be able to see that the concept of 2 is not universal. It seems universal because it's such an easy concept that everyone has the same idea of what 2 is. But like I said earlier, when you get to more, complicated matters, people's ability to understand things breaks down, and they don't have the same ideas and understandings of the same things.
Okay, you're not listening. Listen, you can't listen. Your worldview is so bad, you can't think through the difficult questions because you don't know enough about the philosophical issues to be able to answer competently. I'm telling you this because this is like our 3rd or 4th conversation. You keep making the same mistakes. 2-ness is not dependent. Listen, 2-ness is not dependent upon our minds, because that would mean that 2-ness is a property of the physical world, and we observe it.
There is no such thing as 2-ness. That's the problem. That's the key to understanding why Matt's argument is just nonsensical. There is no 2-ness. There's only the minds that have a concept in them called 2.
And conclude it. But when you do that, you suppose the idea, the law of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, proper inference, and various laws that you presuppose. The issue is, how do you ground the actuality of those laws? They just presuppose, well, they're just true because they're true. Now let's work with them. Wait a minute. You can't just say they're true because they're true. Because if you say that, I can say God is true because God is true. What must be in place in order for those concepts to be there? What must be in place in order for two-ness to be there? That's the question. You can't answer it, and atheists can't answer it.
A mind. The answer is a mind.
Oh, a mind. Okay. So is the mind universal?
The human mind is not, but
okay.
but
So
the
wait a
human mind
minute.
is capable.
If the human mind is not universal, then how do you have the participation of two-ness being universally accurate among different particular minds?
It doesn't have to be universal. It just has to be a concept.
So then,
in
if
your
one
mind.
person's mind doesn't like two, doesn't agree that two is two, and someone else does, which one's correct?
The person who believes in two, because our minds
so then
should conform to reality.
So then what you're conform to reality. So now two is part of reality?
Two is a truth that exists based on observation of the existent universe.
So you observe the number two? Where do you observe two-ness?
No, you don't. Well, when you see two objects, your mind generates a concept called two that is abstract.
So then you're saying two-ness. You're saying that two-ness is generated out of human minds. And so when human minds disagree, who's correct?
Yeah.
So when
there is an external reality that upon which we must base.
So now, are you then saying that two-ness has its own existence apart from human minds and external reality?
No, I mean, I know these are debates that Plato had in his.
So here you go.
Neoplatonic ideas.
Did you hear your toes cracking as you're stubbing your toes against the hard corners of truth and logic? These are the questions I ask atheists. They can't answer them. If they were to
notice he keeps talking about atheists, and I don't know why he's doing that. Someone else pointed this out earlier in the chat. What atheists believe is irrelevant to this discussion. I think he's purposely trying to distract people from what the arguments I'm making.
To work through them with me, and I ask them the questions, all that happens, and it always does the same thing, they end up going in circles. The reason they go in circles is because their worldview is incomplete, and they beg the question, and they can't justify begging the question.
Why is he talking about atheists? I never brought up atheists. He's fallen back on the idea that he beats atheists with these kinds of arguments, but I'm not an atheist, so I don't really know why he's even bringing this up.
Then they come back to me and said, "Matt, you beg the question." You're right, I do, but my worldview can account for begging the questions. Yours can't. The atheist worldview is insufficient and incapable of answering the difficult and grounding the difficult questions. This is why,
may I ask you a question?
Anthony, listen, this is why came up with so many different and contradictory philosophical ideas trying to make sense of actuality.
And religious people haven't come up with different and contradictory ideas of what God is? I mean, just think about that.
They contradict each other all over the place because they don't have a grounding in the Trinitarian God. You got one more minute and we're going to move on.
May I ask you, how do you know what you read in the Bible is true except that you view it through your eyesight and hear the preaching through your ears? We have to be able to perception. You can't even trust the Bible without seeing and hearing it preached. So how do you just...
I must say that is a very good question. Matt is discounting the idea. He's saying that, you have to base reality in the idea of the Christian Trinitarian God. Well, you would never know about the Christian Trinitarian God unless you read the Bible or heard someone speak it. So which comes first, hearing and seeing the Bible or the Christian Trinitarian fundamental basis of reality? Huh? You don't get to the Christian Trinitarian God unless you're capable of observing reality and then forming concepts of in your mind based on what you're observing. So, therefore, how can you say that knowledge must be rooted in something which is itself a derived concept and an idea that must be arrived at from a different method of interpreting reality, namely human sensory perception? You see, this is a good question. Let's see how Matt answers it.
Disregard perception, and rationality and logic.
I didn't.
And say that
I did not. There you go, not listening again. I didn't dismiss them. I said they're not the proper places to ground these issues.
All he does, he said they're not the proper place to ground these issues. Well, what he did there is he rejected the idea that sensory perception is the proper grounding of knowledge and truth claims. What is his ground, though? The Trinity, or the Trinitarian God, whatever you want to say. Well, I want to let you know that you don't, like I just said, like I just argued, and which is very clear to anyone who thinks about it, you don't get to the Trinitarian concept of God unless you read it in the Bible. How do you read the Bible? With your eyes, through your senses, or, you can hear, I guess you can hear someone preach it. Either way, it's sensory perception. So the truth of the Trinitarian God must come through the assumption that our senses and our perceptions of reality are accurate and therefore capable of establishing what is true and what is not true. Am I right or am I right, folks? This is why this form of presuppositionalism is just dead on arrival, because this very serious problem exists. He's going to say he has the Holy Spirit. That's where these conversations always end dirty, is with them having the Holy Spirit and you not having it. That's what I've learned after all my discussions with Christianity. If there's anything I've learned dirty, is that I don't have the Holy Spirit and they do. And they're all saying different things, by the way. So the Holy Spirit has an interesting way of doing things. Oh.
See,
well, you have to ground your understanding of the Bible on your perception.
Anthony,
is the Trinity actually in the Bible? Does Jesus teach the Trinity? Well, first of all, no. Jesus does not ever teach anything like the Trinity. There are places where you can say Jesus appears to be teaching his own deity. But even if you want to say that, which I disagree, and maybe I'll do an analysis of this sometime, that still only gets you to two. Two people being God. So Jesus teaching the Trinity? No. Jesus never teaches the Trinity. He never asks people to believe the Trinity. Is the Trinity actually in the Bible? No. It's really not. But it kind of is a little bit, because there are verses in the Bible, like, you will never find the Trinity concept laid out in one place as an idea or a doctrine or teaching. So what Trinitarians have to do is they have to dance all over the place and pull verses from, 10 different books and piece them together in ways that no one ever thought of before, and which really take them out of context and misinterpret or reinterpret them and fit it all together in this kind of messy mixture that, like, and then they kind of, try to glue it all together and say, there's the Trinity right there. And when you kind of analyze the parts of the Bible which they piece together to give you the Trinity, it can make sense at a superficial level, but the more you look into it, the more you realize that no, there's no Trinity in the Bible. And anything that here's another thing, Layla, and this is going to bother a lot of people. Maybe I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it anyways. A lot of the verses that the Trinitarians use to justify their belief system, people like me don't. What I have done in my own analysis, and maybe someday I'll go over this, these are parts of quote unquote scripture that I would argue are maybe the best way to say it is they should not be there. They are non-authoritative, or they should not be there. And that's going to hurt a lot of your Orthodox, traditional Christians who don't believe that any mistake could have made it into the Bible. And if you're like that, I would still say these verses don't support the Trinity. Even if you assume that every verse in the Bible should be there because it's a book written by God or whatever, there's the Trinity doesn't make sense. It doesn't. There are so many verses. The problem is when they piece together all these verses together, which they say support the Trinity, it does. You kind of have to. It's an interpretation. There's an interpretive range that they interpret the words in such a way that it's possible, but is very it makes it all consistent. But there are other ways of interpreting these verses which it all falls apart, and which are also theoretically possible according to the words being used. And another problem is there are tons of verses in the Bible which disprove the idea of a Trinity logically. So the Trinity is logically impossible, and therefore their interpretation of these verses cannot possibly be true. And I think what I might do, if I have time, which I rarely do these days, maybe my next video I'll talk about the Trinity and all the problems with it. I talked a little bit about it earlier today in this video. I'm not sure if you were here, Layla. You might have been if you weren't listening. Part of the problem with the Trinity is historical. It's just so clear that it was an idea that was developed over time by fallible and sometimes corrupt men who, you can argue that they were, doing what they thought was true. I think some of them were just had their own agenda. Either way, it's very clear when you read the history of the church and the background about the Greek philosophy and how it was all imported and used to kind of establish really important aspects of the Trinity. It's very clear what happened, that this idea of the Trinity is not inherent to Christianity. It's just not. It's not something Jesus taught. It's not something the prophets taught. It's not even really biblical in my opinion. And it's a huge problem in Christianity because a vast majority of your typical Christian pastors and theologians will tell you, if you don't believe the Trinity, it means you're not a real Christian and you're not saved or something like that. And what that means is they're saying your salvation is based on believing a false idea, which is a huge problem. And a lot of it comes from the stuff I'm talking about right now. I want people to break free of their mental prison that they've constructed for themselves so they can analyze these things in a way that is free from emotions and traditions and sentimentality and presuppositions, and just look at things very objectively and just say, is this really the truth? And when you do that, you start thinking about things very logically. You don't think about it in terms of, oh, it's the religion, and if you don't believe this religious doctrine, that means you're not a good Christian or whatever. It's like, well, I don't care if I'm a good quote unquote Christian with a label slapped on me that says Christian across my forehead. I care if what I believe is true, and things that are true must be logically coherent. And the Trinity just isn't. It's not logically coherent. That's the biggest problem I have with the Trinity. It doesn't make sense logically. The ideas don't fit together, and they don't fit together in a way that they can all harmonize with each other in a way that makes everything true at the same time. And again, I can't get into specifics right now because that's not the point of this particular video. But maybe at some time we'll talk about this going forward. All right, let's just try to. We only got a minute left in the conversation. Let's try to close this out.
Don't listen to what I say. You think these things through clearly. You need to study a lot more.
You keep saying that, but you just keep saying that. I don't understand. I don't know. I'm not listening. I am listening to you. I'm telling you, you're wrong.
No, you listen, but you don't hear. You're not. When I say you're not listening to me, you don't understand the issues, which is demonstrating to make the same logic errors. I'm pointing out to you, and when you give me a reason, I undermine each one that you go to, and then you go back and you circle back to the same mistakes. You don't know what you're doing, Anthony. I'm trying to tell you.
Your entire...
We're going to move on because all he's going to do is argue.
All right, there you have it, folks. So let me try to tie all this together, and let me try to explain why this is important. Because a lot of people don't really think about whether what they believe about really important stuff is ultimately justified. They don't really ask themselves how they know what they quote unquote know, or what they think they know. And part of the reason for that is people are being taught to think this way. You're not allowed to question things. You're not allowed to analyze things and critically investigate them or analyze them or anything like that. A good Christian doesn't ask certain questions. A good Christian presupposes the truth of the sacred text. Okay? And you're not allowed, and you heard Matt say, you're not allowed to go to your senses and perceptions, because then you're trying to establish truth outside of God's revelation. And you can't know anything unless God reveals it to you. This is why I always say the true Bible of God is the universe. You know why I say that? Because the universe, assuming you believe in God, was created by God. And when I say the universe, I don't just mean the suns, the stars, the planets, the wind, the sky, the earth. I don't just mean that stuff. I mean the universe, including its physical laws, its laws of nature, chemistry, biology, humanity, human nature, the laws that affect human nature, the laws that affect the human mind. All of these things were established by God, free of any corrupting influence. These are things we can say that were uncorrupted or unpolluted by human interaction. Whereas we really can't say that about any book that's ever been written. Now, that doesn't mean the books aren't true. It doesn't, because humans write truth in books all the time. If I write down on a piece of paper 2 + 2 is 4, I'm not inspired by God to do that. But that doesn't mean it's not true. It is true. And, if someone writes down in a book that George Washington was the first president of the United States, well, that's true, okay? And no one disputes it because it is true. So you can write down things like, these things can be true, but if someone says that George Washington, said that, he was talking one day and he was talking about how he thought King George was a great guy, that might not be true. And, there's not a lot of historical evidence that he felt that way. So you can question it. And, you might question it. You're free to question things like that. And so if you read that in a book, if you read it in the same book that George Washington was the first president and he liked the King of England, well, part of it might be true and part of it might not be. We don't presuppose, you might say, well, this guy was a great biographer. We presuppose the truth of what this biographer would write. But you have to ask yourself, well, what were the biographer's sources? What if the biographer is a big fan of the English monarchy for whatever reason? That sounds silly, but let's just imagine it. And he wants George Washington to, say something like this. I'm just giving an example. Maybe, he could put something in there like that. And then, my point is, we don't presuppose, but, when you're talking about religion, you're not supposed to ask these kinds of questions. And this is why when you presuppose things, you block your mind from the truth. You do. And you would say, well, I can't be a good Christian and not presuppose that, because that means we're questioning God. Well, let me ask you a question. when you look, and this I used this example earlier, let's say you're talking to a Muslim, and they presuppose the truth of the Quran, but you clearly see there's an error in the Quran. How are you going to convince them? How is that person, that Muslim, going to see the truth of the error in the Quran when they've presupposed that the Quran is beyond being questioned? So they've created a psychological castle in their mind that's completely arbitrary, that blocks them from considering this potential truth. And this is what people do when they make religious presuppositions. But our ultimate goal in life, and this, I believe this is what God and Jesus wants for us, is to believe something is true, whatever it is. If the book is a divinely inspired, direct transcript of what God said, just recorded for us in a book, then God wants us to believe that. But if it isn't, if it's, just, people, human beings, fallible human beings doing their best they can but perhaps making some mistakes along the way, well, then why does it make sense that God would want us to believe something like that is perfect? Why would God want us to believe something that isn't true? And what if there are mistakes? Why should we set this presupposition up that blocks us from a potential truth? Why can't we just say, I believe it's true, but I'm willing to entertain the notion that there may be error in it? And I think the reason is mostly emotional. People want to feel like they can believe that their religion is based in absolute certainty. Well, there's the book. The book can't be wrong. So as long as I get the interpretation of the book correct, then I'm guaranteed to be believing the truth, and I can know that I'm going to heaven when I die, no matter what. That's, kind of that. When it comes to Matt's particular argument, I think I did a good job of explaining how the transcendental argument for God doesn't work. I think that the next few conversations kind of deal with this topic. So whenever we continue to do the Matt Slick review series, we will probably see these things pop up again. But I really think it's important that people understand these arguments, because you will see them being promoted, and you will see Christians falling for this. Especially, I see all kinds of Christian YouTube apologists making these kinds of arguments. I've seen it many, many, many times. And it makes them sound smart. It makes them sound sophisticated. But the problem is, when you realize it's wrong, it's very clear how wrong it is, and you shouldn't be using it as an argument to defend Christianity or God, because it's a false argument. Now, there are other arguments for God which are valid and which are much better, in my opinion. So why are we going to use an argument which is just logically false? At the very best. At the worst, what these people are doing is using these kinds of transcendental arguments to set their own particular interpretation of Christianity as the founding and ground of all knowledge, and thus anything outside of that cannot be the truth, essentially. So Matt tried to say that there are transcendentals. When you think of the number 2, it's universal, and it is an abstraction or a concept which can only be explained by God. The existence of a transcendental God. No, that's not true at all. The idea of concepts, all you need to postulate is the existence of a mind. A human mind will do. Even a limited, weak, fallible human mind can generate the concept of 2. And that's all you need. You don't need a transcendental, etherical, Platonic ideal of 2. All you need is a human mind that's capable, or a mind capable, even, maybe some of the other animals can at some very brute level develop the concepts of the number 2. Who knows? It seems like some of them actually can, which is, interesting to think about. But anyways, we know humans can do it, so let's stick there. You don't need to postulate Platonic ideals to think that humans in their minds can think the number 2 and apply it to reality, or any other concept at all, or that we can think logically if there are no such thing as the laws of logic. Because the laws of logic, what it really is, folks, It's just the ideas in our mind corresponding to reality. And that's all it is. And when you're engaging in logic, what you're really doing is in your mind, you're thinking to yourself, if we were to think about how various aspects of reality interact with one another, the logical person is the one whose ideas correctly conform to what would happen. So, like trying to think about, how to build, I don't know, an example, like how to build a house. What is the logic of building a house? Do you start with the roof and build downwards? Or would that work? Or would you start with the foundation or build upwards? Okay, the logical person is going to say to himself, well, I start with the roof. It's not going to work because then I'll have to build into the ground, and that just doesn't make sense. So why don't we start with? So you're thinking to yourself logically. What you're really doing is you're imagining how reality will play out based on your understanding of the concepts involved. So that's really what logic is. It's just thinking about reality and trying to make everything fit together. There's no law of logic. And if there was a law of logic, it'd be like the law of gravity. It would affect everyone at all times. Everyone would be logical. Gravity is a law because it's an actual universal law. No matter where you jump up, you will fall back down unless you have a jetpack. But not everyone's logical, and I think that's very obvious. People get things wrong all the time. There are very illogical and irrational people because there's no laws of logic. Because it's just based on our minds, and some people's minds, their ideas don't correspond to reality. So we should always be trying to make sure our minds the ideas in our mind correspond to what is actually real. And we can't do that if we're presupposing things, because then we're blocking our minds from considering the possibilities. Now, this gets into the nature of the mind. What is the mind? Where does it come from? How does it operate? Is it a product of the brain, or is it something else? Does it have its own existence? Does it exist independently of the body? How does it work? How does the mind generate concepts? These are really interesting questions, which I think about because I guess I'm weird like that. And the bottom line is, the mind is actually, in my opinion, our true self. It's a lot of people, because they observe the physical realm, they think our bodies are ourselves. But our bodies are just lumps of meat. Our bodies are just lumps of atoms. The mind is actually what's controlling everything. The mind, everything we believe and think and do comes from the mind first. And then the mind controls our brain, sends the signals to the brain, which sends the signals to the rest of the body. Everything I'm speaking right now is the result of ideas I'm forming in my mind. My mind sends the signals to my brain, which moves the muscles in my throat and mouth and tongue to say all these things. So everything's starting in the mind. The body can't do anything without the mind. The body is basically a robot controlled by the mind. So the mind takes precedence over everything else, which is why, and the mind has free will. It operates independent of physical laws and constraints like that. So it can go from one concept to the other, and it can embrace or reject various concepts. And it has free will to do this. We can choose to do good, or we can choose to do bad. And depending on what our mind prefers, it will do that. So if we prefer to do what is good, we will do that. If our mind, for whatever reason, prefers to do what is evil, we will do that. The mind will make the choice, and it will direct your body to carry out that choice. So the question is, how do we get our minds to prefer what God wants? That's the real question. That's basically the basis of everything we should be trying to do. What is the reality of what God wants us to do? And how do we get our minds to prefer to do that? And that's what righteousness is. Using our free will to choose the things of God. Yeah, so I think that's good enough for now. If no one has any questions, we might shut it down. I think it's a really interesting topic. It's a lot to think about, but it's all very important, because when you start to think about these things, the reason people fall into error is because they create blind spots for themselves. when you come to truth, when people come to truth, it's like the truth was never absent for them. It's they couldn't see it because they were blocking themselves. When you ask yourself what your presuppositions are and how you can know what you know, when a Christian or whoever starts asking themselves, well, how do I know what I know? What do I think? What do I believe? And is it really provable based on the evidence of, instead of just this emotional, like, well, it makes me feel good, so it must be true because otherwise, God wouldn't let me believe it. Like I want to follow God and I love God, so God's not going to let me, get things wrong. Well, the problem is you're still a human being and you still have free will, and God still gives you that free will. And I know Calvinists will disagree with this, and certain types of people, but they're wrong. What if they're wrong? What if God doesn't regenerate them? What if God is like, okay, you're following me now? Excellent. Now walk and abide in my commandments. Keep figuring things out. All right, you've put your trust in Jesus. There's a lot more you have to go. I'm not going to just download all the right answers into your mind. And this is why people change their minds in Christianity. You hear people talking about how they spent decades as a Trinitarian and then they became a Unitarian. And then you hear people who spent decades as Unitarians or whatever, or preterists, or Calvinists, or Lutherans, or Wesleyans, or Catholics. They change their minds. What was it? Well, is it because they, is it because, God, gave them a little hint, or gave them, took things over for a while and gave them that? Or is it because they observed something that they realized that their previous beliefs couldn't correspond to what's true? Sometimes I wonder if all our thoughts come from the brain or if some come from the heart too. Well, our thoughts do not come from either the heart or the brain. You might disagree with me on this, Dirty, and this is something to think about. But our thoughts don't come from any physical organ in our body. Believe it or not, our mind is not in the brain. Our mind interacts with our brains. Our mind sends the thoughts. Our mind thinks the things that we think, and when we do something physically with our body, it's the mind sending the idea to our brain. The brain is obviously connected to the nervous system, and let's say I want to move my mouse around to my computer. First, my mind is going to decide to move the mouse. Then it's going to. And this all happens very quickly. It happens in less than a fraction of a second. It happens so fast that it can't be measured by like a clock or anything like that. But when I decide to put my hand on the mouse and move it like that, right now I'm moving the mouse because my mind is sending a signal to my brain, and my brain is connected to the nerves in my spinal cord, and those nerves run down into my hand and fingers. So all the time I'm moving my mouse like this, it's because my mind is sending a signal to my brain, which is moving my hand through my nervous system. And now I'm going to decide to stop moving my mouse right now. And my mouse stopped. Because I told my mind to stop moving the mouse, to stop moving the mouse. So my mind is no longer telling my brain to move my fingers and hands. So it's really interesting to think about. So I don't think any other system works. If you want to say that the thoughts come from your brain, there's a lot of issues with that, Dirty. There's a lot of problems with that. So is there a realm where my mind exists and it interacts with my brain in the real world? Is it something like the immortal? Yeah. Actually, it's hard to really, we can't observe it, but I think that must be the case. Somehow our mind exists somewhere and is interacting with our brain. And this is actually something, Dirty, if you want to look into it. This is something that Descartes talked about. There's a really famous French philosopher named René Descartes. I would recommend you kind of look a little bit into what he said. Because he invented a school of, he didn't invent it, but he popularized a school of thought called dualism. and they're basically there's basically two schools of, I mean, it's hard to simplify it, but there are two schools of thought when it comes to the mind. There are what's called dualists, and obviously non-dualists. And non-dualism is kind of like materialism. It's like your typical scientific perspective, which says that the mind is a product of the brain. But dualists are people that believe that their dual means two. So two substances. Your mind is one substance and your body is one substance. And our physical senses, the reason they can't see the mind is because even though it's made of a substance, our physical organs are only capable of observing things within a certain spectrum of reality that corresponds to the physical world, which is our bodies. So people are observing our bodies because that's how our eyes and senses are designed to observe the physical world. So we believe that everything that's going on in our heads is a result of the physical. But that's only because our senses can only investigate this limited part of reality, and we can't see the substance that the mind is made of, so we assume it doesn't exist. But the mind is actually behind the scenes a real substance. What it's made of, no one obviously knows. But it's there and it's existing, and we just don't see it. But it's kind of the puppet master, if you will. It's the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, you know. It's the one pulling the strings of the human body. Yeah, look up interesting. Yeah, look up Rene Descartes. This is a philosophical issue that's been debated for a long, long time. I think Descartes, let me look it up real fast. Let me see. When did he live? When did Descartes live? And I don't agree with everything Rene Descartes said. That's spelled Rene is Rene, and then Descartes is spelled Descartes. I'll put it in the chat. And when did he live? He was a really famous philosopher. He lived in the early 1600s. So about 1 century after Calvin and the Luther and the Reformation. But he was I think he was religious, but he didn't really use the Bible to justify his ideas, which I don't have a problem with. He didn't reject the Bible, but he just thought about things from a very logical and rational perspective, which I'm not saying Christians don't do that, even though a lot of them don't, but not necessarily. But he kind of talked about this problem, and ever since then, it's been it's called the philosophy of mind, and it's a really interesting subject, in my opinion. But again, I'm probably a little weird, so I think things are interesting that not a lot of other people do. Yeah, so things to think about, things to mull over in your mind. There you go. There's the mind. There it is again. Yeah. So if no one has any questions or comments, I think we're going to shut this thing down. I'll give it about another minute. I haven't thought about this subject much. I guess I always thought the mind was a product of physical body, mortal but resurrectable. Yeah, it's something. There's a lot there, Dirty. If you haven't thought about it, think about it, and you might stick with what you currently believe. But if it's worth considering all the various options. If you don't consider the options, how will you know if you've made the right choice? If you haven't thought about it deeply, and try to figure out which option might be the true one. All right. I'm not really seeing any questions or anything or comments. That's probably because I'm not, maybe I put everyone to sleep, but I think these things are interesting. I think they're important. I wish more people would. Oh, good. Samantha's still here. Oh, wait, that's not what I clicked. Good discussion. Thank you. Still confused with a lot of these topics. There's so many. I know, Samantha. It's so easy, but it's so complicated, right? Like, why can't it just be easy? It really is easy. The problem is the reason you have to think about these things is because people believe them. And if you don't understand how they think, then you can't bring them to the truth because you can't show them how they're wrong. So learning about the various ways of thinking is beneficial, if only because when we meet these people, then we can better converse with them and interact with them. My brain really hurts. Oh no. Well, yeah, this was a tough one. It was. But congratulations for making it to the end, because while I think these things are really interesting, I think it's a testimony to you that you're listening to these things and considering them, which a lot of people don't do, which is why they fall into the traps I'm trying to save them from. So I think by thinking about these things, Samantha, you're in a much better position to. And honestly, Samantha, I feel like from my conversations with you, you're pretty. You're good. The reason I think someone like you should probably learn things like this is if you want to help other people who are thinking these things, and you just want to have an argument for them to dialogue with them. Yeah, once you've come to the truth yourself, the only reason you really need to look at all the bad ideas out there is to help the people who still have those bad ideas. But it's not really for you, so I wouldn't really worry about it too much. I don't know if I agree with you, A, or not. Brain, the spirit, and the soul, and the spirit of God all interconnect, and our brain stores information. That's fine, New Genesis. Yeah, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you figured it out and I haven't. That's the thing. I'm always willing, if someone puts an argument forward that refutes me. A lot of people will accuse me of just, blowing smoke. But honestly, though, if I saw someone make an argument that I felt refuted what I was saying today, I would be obligated to believe it, even if it hurt my emotions. So maybe you're right. Maybe you're the one who's figured it out and I haven't. Thoughts can be directed. I have placed ideas at places and others have picked them up and went with them as their own. Well, that's certainly interesting. Okay. That's telepathy, things like that. Who knows? Who knows? All right, folks. I think people's brains are hurting, so maybe it's a good time to shut this thing down. Rewatch. I recommend you rewatch this video. I think a lot can be learned from this conversation. I think it can get you. It's very thought provoking. There are a lot of things that Matt and I discussed in this video that are worth considering, and which I think can help people break free from the prisons, as I call them. They've constructed the arbitrary walls they've constructed in their minds. You really need to ask yourself if those walls need to be there, or why they're there, or why they should be there. Okay? All right. Thank you everyone who listened. Thank you everyone who tuned in. Thank you everyone who interacted in the side chat. And until next time, God bless.